Today is May 16th, 2026, and in the last 72 hours, something quietly happened in Beijing that just rewrote the entire military calculus of the Persian Gulf. China refused to send weapons to Iran. Not delayed, not deferred, refused. And before you scroll past this as another diplomatic shrug, let me show you what this actually means. Because the headline says, China declines arms request. The operational reality says something far more dangerous for Tehran. Iran just discovered, in the middle of the most intense U.S. military posture in the Strait of Hormuz in a decade, that the great power it spent 10 years building its entire deterrence theory around is not coming. And the U.S. military just received the single most consequential strategic gift it could have asked for, without firing a shot. This is not the surface event. This is proof that Iran's foundational assumption, the assumption that Beijing would underwrite Tehran's escalation ceiling, was always going to fail the moment it was actually tested. And it just got tested. Pull the lens back, because what looks like a diplomatic story is in fact the collapse of an entire deterrence architecture, and the United States Central Command knows it. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why the Pentagon's next 48 hours look very different than Iran believed they would, and why the regime in Tehran is now operating under a strategic ceiling it cannot raise. Let me expose the false assumption first, because everything Iran has done in the Gulf for the last 18 months rests on it. Iranian doctrine, going back to the comprehensive strategic partnership signed with Beijing in March 2021, was built on a very specific bet. The bet was this: if Iran could keep Chinese oil flowing through Hormuz, and if Iran could keep offering Beijing discounted crude at roughly 1 to 2 million barrels a day below market, then in any genuine confrontation with the United States, China would provide what Tehran calls strategic depth. That phrase matters. Strategic depth in Iranian planning meant access to advanced Chinese munitions, anti-ship missile technology, integrated air defense components, drone subsystems, and crucially, replacement stocks for the missile and UAV inventory that Iran has been burning through at an unsustainable rate since the exchanges of 2024 and 2025. That assumption just died, and here is the operational proof. When Iranian officials reportedly approached Beijing through both the diplomatic track and the IRGC procurement channel in recent weeks, asking for accelerated delivery of HQ-9B long-range surface-to-air components, additional YJ series anti-ship missile technology, and replenishment for the depleted Shahid and Mohajer drone supply chains, the answer came back cold. No transfers, no accelerated timeline, no public backing. Beijing's stated reason was the standard formula about regional stability and adherence to non-proliferation frameworks. The actual reason is far more revealing. China did the math. And the math told Beijing that backing Iran militarily, at this exact moment, risks roughly $600 billion of Belt and Road exposure, threatens the Saudi-Iranian normalization that China itself brokered in 2023, and most importantly, puts Chinese ships at direct risk in a choke point that handles approximately 20% of global petroleum liquids and over 30% of seaborne crude. China is not in the business of trading that for Iran's missile war. And the real question is not why Beijing said no. The real question is what Iran does now that it knows the answer. Let me walk you through the chronology, because the sequence matters more than any single event. In late April, U.S. Naval Forces Central Command, NAVCENT, repositioned what open-source naval trackers identified as a reinforced surface action group, anchored around a Nimitz-class carrier strike group, with Arleigh Burke-class destroyers carrying the Aegis combat system and SM-6 interceptors, supported by P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol coverage, operating out of Al Udeid in Qatar. That alone was not new. What was new was the simultaneous arrival of additional F-35C Lightning II squadrons aboard the carrier, F-35A elements rotating through Al Dhafra in the UAE, and most significantly, the forward staging of B-2 Spirit bombers at Diego Garcia, confirmed by commercial satellite imagery in early May. That B-2 deployment is the variable mainstream framing keeps missing. Let me show you what this actually means. The B-2 carries the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, a 30,000-pound weapon specifically designed to defeat the kind of deeply buried, hardened facilities that Iran has spent 2 decades constructing at Fordow, Natanz, and the Parchin complex. The B-2 does not deploy to Diego Garcia for show. It deploys when the United States wants Tehran to understand that the deepest target on the map is now within unrefueled strike range with stealth penetration. And it did so precisely as Iran was waiting for a Chinese answer that never came. Now here is where it gets more serious. While Iran was waiting on Beijing, the IRGC Navy continued its standard pattern in the Strait. Fast attack craft swarms operating out of Bandar Abbas and the islands of Abu Musa, Greater Tumb, and Lesser Tumb. Estimates from regional maritime intelligence put the active small boat fleet at well over 1,000 vessels, with the operationally relevant fast boat subset, the Peykop class and the Zulfiqar class, numbering in the low hundreds. Iran's entire choke point denial doctrine rests on these boats overwhelming Western escorts through saturation. That doctrine has one fatal dependency. It assumes the missiles on those boats and the coastal anti-ship missile batteries backing them up, including the Noor, the Qadr, and the Ghadir variants derived from Chinese C-802 and C-802A technology, can be replenished and upgraded. Without Chinese resupply, that assumption collapses. Let me pull the lens back. Iran's coastal anti-ship inventory is not infinite. Independent assessments from the International Institute for Strategic Studies and from open-source defense analysts have for years pointed out that Iran's precision strike inventory, while large by regional standards, faces a sustainment problem under sustained combat tempo. Each missile fired in a confrontation with U.S. naval forces is a missile that must be replaced, and the replacement pipeline, the actual industrial pipeline, has always relied on Chinese precursor components, guidance electronics, and, critically, the seeker technology that makes those missiles a threat to a maneuvering destroyer rather than a slow tanker. Beijing just turned off the tap, and Tehran knows it. The U.S. capability reveal here is the part I want you to hold on to, because it is what makes the Chinese refusal so consequential. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyers currently in the Gulf are running the latest Baseline 9 and Baseline 10 Aegis configurations. That means cooperative engagement capability across the strike group, meaning one ship's radar can guide another ship's missiles. It means SM-6 Block IB capability for terminal anti-ship and anti-cruise missile engagement out to ranges exceeding 240 kilometers. It means SM-3 for any ballistic threat reaching out of Iranian territory toward the carrier. And critically, it means the integration with the F-35C's distributed aperture system and the AN/APG-81 AESA radar, allowing the fighter to act as a forward sensor node, feeding targeting data back to the destroyers in real time. In plain terms, an Iranian anti-ship missile launched from a Peykop fast boat in the Strait does not face one destroyer. It faces a networked kill chain in which an F-35C orbiting at altitude sees the launch, hands the track to a destroyer 50 miles away, which engages with an SM-6 before the missile ever reaches its terminal phase. That kill chain only fails if it is saturated. And saturation requires the very inventory that Iran was counting on China to backfill. And it gets more serious from here. The U.S. Air Force has been quietly rotating MQ-9 Reaper drones and the newer MQ-9B Sea Guardian variants through bases in the region, including Ali al-Salem in Kuwait and forward locations in eastern Saudi Arabia. The Sea Guardian variant carries the Raytheon Seaview maritime radar, capable of tracking surface contacts across thousands of square miles. Combined with U-2 high-altitude reconnaissance overflights, RC-135 rivet joint signals intelligence platforms, and the persistent coverage of National Reconnaissance Office satellite assets, the United States currently has what defense planners call a near-complete maritime domain awareness picture across the entire Iranian littoral. Every fast boat that leaves Bandar Abbas, every coastal missile battery that lights up its fire control radar, every IRGC Navy commander who issues a command. The United States sees it. Now let me show you the hidden operational turn the headline missed, because this is where the China refusal becomes catastrophic for Tehran in a way most analysts have not yet articulated. Iran's deterrence theory was never just about quantity, it was about ambiguity. The ambiguity that Iran might receive Chinese intelligence support during a confrontation. The ambiguity that Chinese satellites might cue Iranian missile batteries on U.S. naval movements. The ambiguity that Chinese electronic warfare assets, particularly the suite developed for the People's Liberation Army Navy's anti-access systems, might find their way into Iranian hands. That ambiguity is what forced U.S. planners to assume worst-case scenarios in their targeting calculations. That ambiguity is what made Iranian missile launches more dangerous than the missiles themselves, because the United States could never be sure whether a given Iranian volley was being guided by Iranian sensors alone or by something far more capable. China just removed the ambiguity, and the moment the ambiguity died, the U.S. operational planning environment fundamentally changed. Iranian missile launches are now exactly what they appear to be. Iranian missiles, fired by Iranian crews, guided by Iranian sensors, with Iranian limitations. The fog that protected Tehran's deterrence threshold for a decade just lifted, and the United States Indo-Pacific Command, Central Command, and the Pentagon's Joint Targeting Cells now operate with a clarity they have not had in years. Pull the lens back further because this is the larger pattern it confirms. China's refusal is not an isolated diplomatic event. It is the latest data point in a sequence going back to the start of the Ukraine war. Beijing has consistently refused to provide lethal aid to Russia despite enormous pressure from Moscow, because the cost to China's global economic position is too high. Beijing refused to back Hamas militarily after October 2023, despite rhetorical alignment. Beijing has refused to publicly back Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping, even though Chinese-flagged vessels have been given safe passage. The pattern is clear. China will offer Iran, Russia, and the various proxies rhetorical cover, economic lifelines, and diplomatic shielding at the United Nations. China will not offer them weapons that risk a direct confrontation with the United States. That is the operational truth. And Iran just learned it the hard way, in the worst possible moment. So what does the regime in Tehran actually do now? Let me show you the consequence map. Option 1 is escalation in the hope of forcing a Chinese reversal. That is a losing bet, because escalation makes the US response more credible, not less, and Beijing's calculation gets worse, not better, as the conflict grows. Option 2 is de-escalation through back channels, possibly through Oman, possibly through Iraq, possibly through the Saudi line that Beijing brokered. That preserves the regime but represents a strategic humiliation Iranian internal politics may not survive. Option 3 is the proxy lever, activating Houthi missile fire from Yemen, Hezbollah pressure on the northern Israeli border, and Shia militia activity in Iraq and Syria. That option is real, but it has a hard ceiling because each proxy has its own depletion problem, and each one is now being targeted by US and allied forces with increasing precision. Notice what is not on the list. A direct conventional war against US naval forces in the Gulf. Because the moment China refused the weapons request, that option moved from costly to suicidal. Iran's inventory of Khalid Fars and Hormuz-class anti-ship ballistic missiles, derived in part from the Fateh 110 family with terminal guidance packages, is not infinite. Once expended, they cannot be replaced in any meaningful time frame. Iran knows this. CENTCOM knows Iran knows it. And that asymmetry of knowledge is now the dominant variable in every move both sides make. Let me show you what this actually means for the next phase. The United States now has the operational latitude to enforce freedom of navigation in the Strait with a credibility it has not had since the tanker war of the late 1980s. The U.S. Navy can escort tankers, conduct demonstration flights, surface destroyers in provocative positions, and run intelligence collection right up to Iranian territorial waters, with the confidence that Iranian response options are bounded by an inventory the regime cannot replenish. That is not theoretical. That is the new doctrinal reality on the water right now. And the real question is what the United States chooses to do with that latitude, because there are two schools of thought inside U.S. planning circles, and they point in different directions. The first school argues for a pressure campaign short of kinetic action, more aggressive freedom of navigation operations, additional B-2 visibility flights, expanded sanctions enforcement on Iranian oil exports targeting the so-called dark fleet, and a tightening of the financial noose around IRGC procurement networks. The second school argues that the current asymmetry is a window that closes the moment Iran finds an alternative supplier, whether that is North Korea expanding its already significant transfers, or Russia trading missile technology for Iranian drones in a closed loop that Beijing cannot interrupt. That second school argues for using the window now, not later. Let me pull the lens back one more time because there is one more variable that mainstream framing keeps missing: Russia. Moscow's relationship with Tehran has deepened significantly since 2022, with documented transfers in both directions. Iranian Shahed 136 drones flowing to Russia for use against Ukrainian infrastructure, and reciprocal transfers including reported Su-35 Flanker E airframes, advanced air defense components, and electronic warfare suites. The question on every CENTCOM desk right now is whether Russia steps into the void Beijing just created. The honest assessment is that Russia will try, but Russia cannot replicate what China was offering. Russia does not have the industrial capacity, the supply chain depth, or the financial cushion to absorb the cost of being Iran's primary military patron during a confrontation with U.S. naval forces. Russia is currently consuming its own missile inventory at a rate that has forced it to source from North Korea and Iran in the first place. The Russian military-industrial base is not in a position to bail out anyone, let alone replace the Chinese pipeline at scale, which means Iran is alone. Operationally alone, industrially alone, and in the specific theater where it has built its entire deterrence theory, that loneliness is fatal to the strategy. Here is the verdict. China's refusal to arm Iran is not a diplomatic footnote. It is the single most consequential development in the Persian Gulf strategic environment this year, and it has handed the United States military a window of operational dominance that did not exist 72 hours ago. The Iranian regime built its deterrence on three pillars: proxy depth, missile saturation, and the implicit backing of a great power. The proxy depth is being eroded by sustained Israeli and U.S. action. The missile saturation now faces a sustainment crisis without resupply, and the great power backing just publicly evaporated. Three pillars, all three cracking simultaneously. That is not a balanced regional situation. That is a regime that has run out of room. What happens next depends almost entirely on whether Washington recognizes the window for what it is and acts inside it, or whether the institutional caution that has shaped U.S.-Iran policy for 2 decades reasserts itself and lets the moment pass. My honest read, based on the B-2 deployment to Diego Garcia, the carrier posture in the Gulf, the F-35 forward staging, and the visible tempo of MQ-9 and P-8 patrols, is that CENTCOM understands the asymmetry and is positioning to exploit it. Whether the political leadership in Washington follows through is the variable I cannot predict. But the operational table is set in a way it has not been set in years. The next 48 hours matter more than the last 2 weeks. Watch for 3 signals. First, any Iranian announcement that reframes the Chinese refusal as a mutual understanding or a regional consultation, because that language is the regime preparing its domestic audience for a forced de-escalation. Second, any movement of U.S. surface combatants into provocative positions inside the strait, particularly near Larak Island or the Greater Tumb approach, because that is the Navy testing whether Iran's response options have actually shrunk. Third, any sudden activity from North Korean cargo aircraft routes or Russian AN-124 transport flights toward Iranian airports, because that is the alternative supply chain attempting to fill the void. If you see the first signal, Iran is folding. If you see the second, the United States is pressing the window. If you see the third, the window is closing. Subscribe and turn on notifications because the next 48 hours may matter more than the last 2 weeks. Drop your prediction in the comments. Does Tehran fold? Does Washington press? Or does the supply chain shift? Stay informed, stay ahead.